Just a quick thank you to the team at TTArtisan for sending me out their 100mm F2.8 2x macro lens to test and review. In this video, I'll be giving you some sample shots in both stills and video, as well as giving you my pros and cons on the lens. Retail, it costs just a little over $300 US. So for that price, is it good or garbage? Let's find out. Hello and welcome back to the channel. First of all, I want to make one thing perfectly clear. I'm not a macro photographer, nor do I pretend to be a macro photographer. That being said, will I be able to get some decent shots with this new TTArtisan 100mm F2.8 2x macro lens on my Nikon Z7? As most of you know who regularly watch my channel, the photography I enjoy doing mostly is landscape, long exposure, and birds and wildlife. Macro is just something I've just dabbled in the past. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is, if I can achieve some decent macro shots with this lens, then maybe those with limited macro experience like me can as well. Let's start things rolling by having a look around this lens to begin with. It's a full frame lens and has an all metal construction. Has a 67mm filter thread, and max aperture is f2.8 and minimum is f22. Minimum focus distance is 25 centimeters and the lens weighs in at approximately 750 grams. Now this lens is completely manual. In other words, you have to manually focus it by the focus ring on the front and change the aperture via the ring at the rear. So there is no communication with your Nikon Z mount camera, which means no eye detect and no image stabilization. Should also mention, you do get a cold shoe mount for the front of the lens if you do want to mount things like small lights, for example. On the lens, your magnification ratios are clearly marked in red, making it easier to set the focus quickly to what you want. I'm going to jump right into this and show you some sample shots that I took, and while I'm doing that, I'm going to share my experience that I had with this lens. I kept my f-stop at around f8 to f11 to give me some depth of field with these shots. The settings are down the bottom of the screen. So I turned the focus peaking on the Z7 to assist me with focus and just moved ever so slightly inwards or outwards until I got the focus point I wanted. But even then you have to shoot at a higher shutter speed to minimize blur, which drives your ISO up quite high. To give you guys an idea of the type of magnification ratios, I then moved the lens to 1:1 and then 2:1. So this is a grevillea flower in my garden. It's just in the midst of blooming. This is what it's like at 1:1, and then finally pushing in to 2:1. Now this is a kangaroo paw flower. It's just starting to come out. Let me push into 1:1. So at 1:1 you can see the fine details starting to come through. Let me push into 2:1. It's really amazing how you can see each little individual fiber on that petal. Before I show you this next shot, here's some footage of the camera with the lens. And look how small this flower is. I mean, this flower is only something like about 5 millimeters wide. And this is the shot at a 1:1 magnification ratio. It's just amazing how you can see each one of those little fine details right in the middle of that flower. So I turned my attention to our insect and bug friends we have here in Australia. Well, some of them are not really friends. I went down to the nature reserve. This is a shot of a moth. Now, look at its head. It's actually turning around and looking at me. I took this handheld. Now again, I wasn't able to focus stack with this. You really need to do some focus stacking to get the whole moth in focus. But it really is amazing. I had my focus peaking on its head, and look at those details around its eye. So one thing I've picked up with this lens, it is very difficult to get handheld shots at a magnification ratio of 2:1. You really do have to rely on a higher shutter speed so you don't blur your shots. Now here's a shot of this fly that I found on a branch. It was quite cooperative for me to begin with. So I got this shot at 1:1. It's amazing the detail around the head and the wings. Now by the time I went to 2:1, the fly had just took off. This little tiny blue dragonfly dropped by to say hello. This measured about 2.5 centimeters long. Now, it took me quite a number of goes to get this shot. It's just lucky that this dragonfly stuck around. Now, the wind was blowing because I was trying to get the focus peaking on its head, but because the wind was blowing, it kept going in and out so easily. So I got this shot at a 1:1 ratio, and even at 1:1, it was proving a little bit difficult to get the focus because the wind was blowing, the dragonfly kept on going up and down, and I eventually did nail a focus right on its head. Here's another shot with this dragonfly. Again, this ratio is at 1:1. So here's one of my favorite macro shots that I got of this little type of flying mantis. It was in bright sunshine, and I used a higher shutter speed with this one, around about 1/500th of a second. So I started off with a magnification of 1:1, and you can see the detail on this little guy's wings is just amazing. So because this little guy was being so well behaved and staying dead still for me, I then switched the lens to 2:1 magnification. Again, even though this guy was still, there was this ever so slight movement, and it wasn't so much this little guy, it was me breathing. Taking shots at 2:1 is just so hard handheld with this particular lens. So I took quite a number of shots, and I eventually ended up getting this shot where I nailed the focus on its eye. So while I was walking through this nature reserve, I noticed on this tree, there were a whole bunch of cicada exoskeletons. Now, this is what happens when cicadas are going from young and they're maturing into their adult stage. They basically back out and leave their shell. It's a perfect formation of what they were. It's just amazing. So this hollow shell was sitting on this branch. Now, luckily what I did was I kind of like leant up against this tree to give me more stabilization. And I got some nice bokeh in the foreground and background. Here's another angle of this exoskeleton. I'm looking down the tree, and again, I jarred myself up against this tree to give me some sort of stabilization while taking this shot. Now, this shot really isn't in perfect focus, but I wanted to show you this as a sample of the type of things that I was dealing with when using this lens. This is 2 lady beetles that I found on this leaf. I'm not too sure what they're doing here. Maybe it's the wild thing, I don't know. You can see the head of the first lady beetle is just ever so slightly out of focus. Now, I was at an f-stop of f11, and I swear I did have my focus peaking on the head, but I must have just missed it because just that slightest bit of movement in or out, and you do miss that vital focus where you really want, which is on the head. This is my last shot that I took with this TTArtisan 100mm F2.8 2x macro lens, and it's of a butterfly. So this shot was taken at a 1:1 magnification, and when you push in, you can see that amazing detail around its head. You know, when I was doing some of these macro shots, I have a new appreciation for dedicated macro photographers out there. It really does take a lot of patience, skill, and concentration. Because when you're doing things like landscape photography, your field of vision is kind of like this. Whereas when you're doing macro photography, your field of vision has to turn inwards. And you've got to concentrate. When you're walking around, you've got to look for the finest little things on things like trees or flowers, and you've got to act quickly to get the shot. Now, one thing I noticed about some of the other reviews with this lens, they didn't really talk about some of the advantages it has in video. I'll just run you some footage here where I combine the lens with my variable ND filter kit to achieve 4K at 25 frames per second at 1/50th of a second for that filmic effect. So I set the lens aperture to wide open at f2.8, and I was able to achieve some beautiful bokeh on these shots in my garden. And you'll notice I did use the macro element of this lens to get right in for some of these flower shots. So here are my pros and cons when it comes to this TTArtisan 100mm f2.8 2x macro lens. I'll start off on the pros firstly. For the price you pay for this lens, it does a great job for macro shots, so you do get bang for your buck. If you're a beginner and wanting to get into macro photography, or you're not splashed with cash right now, who is, then I would be considering this lens. The image quality was very good, as you've seen from some of my example shots. Mind you, you have to nail that focus to achieve this, but I'll talk more about that in the cons. The focus ring turns really smoothly, and the aperture ring has nice definitive clicks, so you can't accidentally bump it and knock it out of place. Another thing I noticed, the lens mounted smoothly and firmly on my Nikon Z7 with no sort of play on the mount, which you do get occasionally with other third-party lenses. Okay, so here are my cons. As I mentioned, not having any sort of image stabilization makes this lens near on impossible to get shots at 2x magnification handheld. Just the slightest bit of movement in or out, and you do miss focus a lot. You have to use the lens combined with either a tripod or monopod in a more controlled setting when doing 2x magnification shots. And even then, the subject you're photographing has to stay dead still, and you can't be moving because your focus depth is limited even at f11. And because of no stabilization handheld, you do have to resort to using higher shutter speeds, which drives your ISO up because you're using f-stops like f11 for depth of field. This then introduces a lot of noise into your shots. Now, my biggest con with this lens is the fact that it is all manual. It means you can't focus stack, which is kind of a big deal when it comes to macro photography to achieve better depth of focus with your shots. You can see here, focus stacking is grayed out on my Z7. Yes, you can focus stack manually, but that is a pain, and you would only have to be photographing something like an inanimate object in a controlled setting like a studio. To get better results though, you're gonna have to realize you're gonna have to fork out a ton more cash for those specific macro photography lenses that do communicate to your Z mount cameras for things like focus, aperture, stabilization, and importantly, focus stacking. Just keep that in mind. Anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed the review. Never stop creating, and I'll see you next time.